I thank Richard for his speech and now invite the first negative speaker from Monash Stephen to start the case.
Madam Speaker, for over 50 years, the Muslim Brotherhood has been the standard bearer of legitimate democracy in Egypt. For decades, they refused to partake in Mubarak's show elections and refused to grant legitimacy to that democratic process on the basis that that democratic process was illegitimate. And we think that it is entirely inconsistent for that party and for the affirmative team to advocate that that party that has had such a consistent stand against the illegitimacy of democracy in Egypt to now become part of the system that will allow the tyranny of the particular interests in Egypt that are not part of that democratic process. Not just is it ironic enough that the Muslim Brotherhood would now start supporting a system that is not democratic, we think it is in the worst interests of democracy in Egypt and for the ongoing resolution of the deep-seated conflicts that exist within that particular state. I really apologise if I lose the ability to speak later on in this particular speech. I have 3 points of substantive. First, why is it illegitimate for the Muslim Brotherhood to participate in the caretaker government? Secondly, why opting in to that caretaker government leads to worse democracy in the short term? And finally, how exactly is it that the negative team will get better democracy in Egypt? To begin with, I have 1 point of rebuttal, and that is an analysis of the various ademocratic stakeholders within Egypt. The first one identified as important in this debate by the affirmative team was the army, in saying that it's really important for everybody in the debate to acknowledge that the army has a huge amount of power outside of the democratic system. Exactly, ladies and gentlemen. The army has an enormous amount of power outside the democratic system. And so we agree with all of the analysis that says that the army is not very supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood. But the analysis actually goes far deeper than them not just liking Islamists. The reality is that the army has the direct incentive to maintain stability within Egypt at all costs. That's because, as pointed to by the affirmative team, their interests are primarily economic. And people don't buy things when their businesses are being destroyed. They don't buy things when they have no money. They don't buy things when there's huge amounts of civil disobedience. That means that the army always has the incentive to go for the path of least resistance in terms of maintaining the most stable kind of government. But that stable kind of government may be democracy now, but it certainly wasn't for the Mubarak years, and it certainly isn't at the moment. The most stable form of democracy, the most stable form of government, rather, they have is not a system of democracy. It is one that they have given power to specific people within Egypt with the aim of co-opting the majority and attempting to restore order. But that calculus doesn't change for the army under anything that the affirmative team is doing. All it does is maintain the fact that the army has a huge amount of power within Egypt. All it does is make sure that in the future, the army will always opt for the thing that will do it in its best interest and does nothing to challenge that. We think that the Muslim Brotherhood maintaining protests is essential to that particular task. I have more of that in substantive. The second thing we'd like to point to also is the characterization of the affirmative team as maintaining not the affirmative team maintaining power in Egypt, that's wrong. The secularists and other kinds of actors within Egypt that hold amount of kind of like realpolitik power, like the secularists holding the courts and other kinds of actors. The problem with the affirmative team is that in an instance where you cannot be secured of the fact that you'll be able to contest the next election, is that it incentivizes all of those groups to be able to use their kind of realpolitik power to hold on to the power that they have, because the democracy that you've created doesn't facilitate that kind of exchange of power in a peaceful method. If it's shown that the army is able to exert its will by being able to override elections as soon as it suits it, if it creates the incentive for those institutions as well, and the people that hold them, to be able to use that power in a way that is also undemocratic. The ultimate aim that you wanted was more stability, you didn't get it. Alright, why is it illegitimate for the Muslim Brotherhood to participate in the caretaker government? Firstly, we think that in a country of 80 million people, the fact that 14 million people disagree with the government is not a right of those 14 million people to rule that country. The fact that in a democracy there is an amount of tyranny of the majority that results is not so much of a justification to say that just because a large number of people disagree with that government, that means that that government is illegitimate and should be removed. Why? Well, we think that there's a certain degree to which you just need to have a certain amount of term limits and a certain amount to which the government is just able to do its thing in order for a democracy to function. It would be utterly unbelievable if you were to have a democracy where you were to have elections every week, or you would, or more realistically, in the case of Egypt, you had a government that constantly feared being overturned by the army as soon as it did anything that, say, for example, did not lead to the maximum amount of economic growth. It would mean that the government wasn't given the actual space that it required to implement any policy under the long term. It means that the government would not have the capacity to actually govern. We think for that reason, just because 14 million people don't agree with what the government is currently doing, doesn't vitiate the fact that the democracy needs a certain amount of space within which the government can actually function. We think for that reason, the fact that people disagree with the government does not mean that they have the right to demand its removal and a new government brought in that they happen to like a little bit more. The second thing is that we actually think that this is not in the interests of the Muslim Brotherhood for the reasons that I flagged in my introduction. It is a party that has established support in Egypt for being people who have promised its supporters a democracy and promised its supporters the ability to vote and to interact with each other in a democratic system. And a majority of people elected the Muslim Brotherhood on that basis. To now participate in a government and a democracy that does not stand for that particular function is a betrayal of its voting base. We actually think that this will lead to likely a huge loss of supporters for the Muslim Brotherhood. And likely, as I will now go into to describe, the reality is that those supporters will likely support parties that are more extreme in their use of apolitical power, because that is now, as the message that you have given to those supporters, the way in which they will affect their will within Egypt. So, why does opting in lead to worse democracy? Well, the government is, at the moment, basically, the caretaker government, that is in keeping with the broad interests of the army. General Sisi, the terribly, unfortunately named general of the Egyptian army, has come out and said that it wants to oversee the constitutional reformation process as such that it can instill and maintain the traditional position of the army as a political actor within Egypt. We think that means that what happens is that as soon as the caretaker government does something that the Egyptian military does not like, as soon as it attempts to make a constitution that attempts to remove the Egyptian military, it will remove those people. We think that means that the government and the kind of democracy that is created by the affirmative team is one that mandates the army's involvement in that process and means that the army is likely in the future to do more of the things that are in its interest, not less. Ultimately, we also think that that there's no incentive for people to continue to agitate change in Egypt, and that's the reason why protests are so very important. Because the problem at the moment in a democratic system is where so much power is concentrated outside of the democratic system, so much power is concentrated in the army, and the way in which the army responds to existential threats in terms of the stability of the nation means that the protests that Muslim Brotherhood are taking in are the only way in which the Muslim Brotherhood will ever be able to actually contest against the power of the army. It's the only level on which the army is willing to engage with the democracy. The army only ever gets involved unless its will be shown when there is a potential amount of instability in the country. It doesn't care about the outcome of elections. What it cares about is stability, and we think that the Muslim Brotherhood, in continuing protests and continue to destabilize the country, is the way in which it will actually get to challenge the army on that particular basis. How do we get better long-term democracy? Beavis is going to go into more detail about how this leads to better long-term buy-in, especially in the region. But the reality is that democracy is about the long-term buy-in of particular actors. It means that instead of taking to the streets and protesting and demanding the removal of the government when you lose an election, it means that you will instead opt to contest the next election. That is the ultimate standpoint we have for Egypt. Ultimately, we think that democracy takes a really long time to bring in. We think it's really, really difficult. But ultimately, in rewarding apolitical actors and ensuring the system in which they operate is one in which they are rewarded for not participating in that democracy, means we will not get it. But for those reasons, we are very proud to oppose.